Thank you for joining us at today's event. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today. I'm really sad that we have converted this to an online event. We absolutely were hoping to do it in the flesh. We were very excited that we would all get to be together at UTS on International Women's Day, but of course, the severe weather and the advice from the state government about not catching public transport over these 2 days really made us err on the side of caution and shift to an online event. It has been a really difficult time for a whole lot of people, so I really want to extend my sympathy and support from UTS and from the Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion to those that the floods have affected. So we're really delighted, although virtually, to be here with all of you to celebrate International Women's Day. And this event is just one of many that are happening around UTS to showcase the important work that's been done to tackle gender inequality in our country. I'd like to begin by welcoming Auntie Glendra Stubbs. Auntie Glendra is the UTS Elder in Residence, and she's going to open today's event and conduct an acknowledgement of country. She brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to UTS, and she's a mentor for all students and staff. She's also the former CEO of Link Up Aboriginal Corporation and Aboriginal Engagement Advisor with No More, which is the non-government legal organisation supporting people giving evidence to the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. Auntie Glendra is extremely passionate around out-of-home care issues, in particular the younger Aboriginal generation in the system. Auntie has been an advocate for over 30 years and is a trained counsellor. So I'd now like to welcome Auntie Glendra to do an acknowledgement of country.
Oh, thank you, Verity. I don't tell people I'm a counsellor because no one wants to talk to you then. But if you say you're the auntie, everyone wants to talk to you, eh? So thank you, Verity. It's always wonderful to be in your presence. So happy International Women's Day in solidarity with women facing poverty, violence and war across this planet. I want to also acknowledge the achievements of strong women that have left this planet a better place. So hugs to them and anyone that has lost a strong woman. I remember this meeting these young women in Warburton, which isn't Warburton that's in the city, it's Warburton way out in the remote community. And it was women there that have brought that community into a much better place. They decided that the kids weren't getting lunches, so they started doing hospitality. Then they realised that the elders weren't getting looked after. So this is all bringing employment to the young ones, and big support. So that community is now one of the most thriving communities, all by a few women saying, we want our kids to be fed well, we want our elders looked after, we want our young ones in work. And that was all from a few women. So a few women can do that. Think of what we can do as lots of women. And, people at UTS and people that are on the virtual are all articulate, educated women. So, no pressure, but, we're all depending on you, eh? So like Verity said, Yalamandu Marang Galindara. So Glendra or Galindara, which is my name, means peaceful waters. Now, I'm peaceful and I'm calm until there's not social justice. And then I become the raging wild river. So, you're sometimes given a name for a reason, I believe. So like Verity said, I am the elder and I would like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the Gadigal people where the UTS college is and of the Eora Nation. I'm on Durrock and Gundungurra land in the beautiful Blue Mountains, and I'm sure you are all on a different land. So I put out a little challenge to find out on the area that you're at, what are the traditional owners of that land? And try and learn a word, just hello. Like Yalamandu Marang is hello. Yama's hello in Sydney. So, just a little challenge out there by the auntie. So as we share our knowledge, teaching and research practices within this university, may we pay respects to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodians of country and acknowledge their struggles and their strengths so that we can have opportunities that weren't afforded to them. And I think one of those, the best opportunities that we can have is the opportunity for higher education. And UTS is a place where you can be the best you are and you get supported in lots of ways to be the very best you are. So I'm always proud to put my hand up and say, love UTS, love all that it does. And, you know, I can't say how honoured and privileged I am to be in all your presence. So big, happy International Women's Day, and think of our sisters all around the planet, eh?
Thanks, Auntie Glendra. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Leslie Hitchens, who's the UTS Acting Provost and Vice President. Leslie joined UTS in 2008, and so she served as an Associate Dean Research and then became the Dean of the Faculty in 2013. And she's now, of course, our Provost. So over to you, Leslie.
Thank you, Verity. And Auntie Glendra, thank you also for that really powerful acknowledgement and acknowledgement as well of the day that's bringing us all here, International Women's Day. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this virtual celebration of International Women's Day here at UTS. As a community at UTS, we come together to recognise both the outstanding achievements and the successes of those fighting gender inequity, but also to take time to highlight the ongoing issues and work still to be done. And there is a lot of work needing to be done in Australian society and through our institutions, and that has been so starkly demonstrated over the past year. And I'd also just like to take a moment to acknowledge the women and children of Ukraine who are caught up in this terrible situation and to remember them on this particular day. Today's keynote speaker, Jess Hill, recently wrote an essay titled The Reckoning, which is the topic of today's conversation and a reflection on the collective rage at the lack of accountability and change in our society. Gender inequity and gendered violence is a wicked problem worldwide. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's compounded by the intersection of other social issues: culture, race, visa status, income, age, geography, class beliefs, and sexuality are all inseparable factors in how women experience life and how we as a society respond to their experiences. The rage that Jess Hill writes about and that Auntie Glendra just talked about, the raging waters, is fully justified, and we do not need to apologise for that rage. Universities, though, must contribute their support and considerable resources, working alongside the experts in communities and frontline practitioners to tackle these issues. We exist for the public good, not just for those who pass through our doors, but for all civil society. Our vision here at UTS is to be a leading public university of technology, recognised for our global impact. And we know that we can only achieve that vision when positive social change is at the heart of all we do. We have to challenge stereotypes, fight bias, broaden perceptions, and remedy injustices where we see them. Here at UTS, we believe everyone has the right to live, study, and work safely, and we are deeply committed to continuing our work to ensure that our university community is safe, inclusive, and respectful for everyone. So thank you for joining us today to be a part of this really important conversation. And a huge thank you to Jess Hill and Professor Saba Bebawi. We can't wait to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. That was a wonderful opening. So now to the business of our event. It's my huge pleasure to welcome up Jess Hill for today's conversation with Saba Bebawi, and it's going to be great. So I'll introduce them both to you now. But before I do that, I also want to quickly point out that there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So if you do have a question, what we want you to do is to type it in the Q&A box, which you'll find in your Zoom control panel. The good thing about the Q&A box is that you can then upvote questions that others have asked. So that means that I don't know how Saba's going to do it, but I often use the ones that have got the most votes because they're usually the best questions. So you can upvote other people's questions, but remember, please try to keep your questions relevant to the topics we're discussing here today. I also want to apologise. We normally have closed captions for all of our webinars, but we weren't able to do that today because we shifted to online so quickly. We shifted just yesterday, and every single closed captioner in Sydney is currently doing closed captions for other Women's Day events. So we apologise for that, and we'll do better next time. Professor Saba Bebawi is the head of discipline for journalism and writing at the School of Communications at UTS. She is published on media power and the role of media in democracy building, in addition to investigative journalism in conflict and post-conflict regions. Professor Bebawi has worked as a journalist since 1995 and is also a media development and policy consultant and a media trainer. So we're very excited to have Saba here today to lead this conversation with Jess Hill. Jess Hill probably doesn't need a whole lot of introductions. Jess is a journalist, author and speaker who focuses primarily on social issues and gendered violence. Jess's reporting has won 2 Walkley Awards, an Amnesty International Award and 3 Our Watch Awards. Her first book, See What You Made Me Do, on the phenomenon of domestic abuse and coercive control, was released in 2019 and awarded the 2020 Stella Prize. In 2021, it was adapted into a series on SBS. Her recent projects include a podcast series on coercive control and patriarchy called The Trap, and a quarterly essay on how Me Too has changed Australia, titled The Reckoning, as Leslie's already mentioned. UTS is incredibly lucky because we had Jess as the inaugural journalist in residence with the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, she was named in 2020. So we feel like she's one of ours. Welcome, Jess. It's a real honour to have you here. Over to you, Saba and Jess.
Thank you, Verity. Thanks, Leslie, and thanks, Auntie Glendra. And thanks, Jess, for being here. Really excited to have a chat with you, and we'll keep it relaxed and informal. And I thought what we can do is I'll ask you a few questions, and then you can answer as much as you want, and then we'll open it for questions after that, if there's anything that we've missed, if that works for you. So I guess the first question I'd like to ask you is, you believe that the Me Too movement has morphed from raising awareness of the ubiquity of sexual violence into an accountability movement. So tell us, what's the difference?
Well, thank you, Saba. Thanks, Verity. Thanks, Auntie Glendra. Really appreciate being invited to speak today. There's so many things that we can talk about on International Women's Day, and it's a real pleasure to be with you guys today. So what is the difference? Well, that's what I was really contemplating as I wrote this essay was, we've had consciousness raising since the 1970s, when it became, the most prevalent, where women would gather in living rooms and talk to each other about the experiences they'd had when they started to get this sense of a commonality of experience. And so many of them had experienced harassment or sexual assault, and started to strategize in those lounge rooms as small groups of women as to what they were going to do about it. I think that what has really typified the consciousness raising movements has been very much focused on awareness raising. Me Too had that awareness raising component, but the awareness raising happened as a result of the way that Me Too, as it launched in 2017, the Hollywood version, not the Tarana Burke version, which launched a decade earlier, it had at its heart the need for accountability. So in a way, as I wrote in the essay, that this wasn't the consciousness raising movement of old, which is like, I was raped and let's discuss what rape is. Let's discuss how it fits into the broader system of patriarchy. It's, I was raped and he is the one who raped me and they are the ones who protected him. And that was building on at least 20 years. And, you know, it's hard to put a pin in the beginning. I don't think it has a beginning point, but at least 20 years of us really coming to terms with not only the nature of perpetration of sexual violence, but the nature of how institutions will form a protective ring around perpetrators, especially when they have power. So I think what was the reason why Me Too raised awareness is because suddenly women were naming the institutions and the rapists and the harassers. And so there was this sense, I think, you know, in a lot of, first of all, it was a sense amongst everybody who was watching it, like, oh my God, either a sense of horror or a kind of mixture of exhilaration, a sense of like a floodgate opening, but really something quite unprecedented. But I think also, as I've written, you know, in the amygdala of men worldwide, that old reptilian part of the brain that, like, you know, really processes fear, it's like, this time they're coming for us. What have I got in my history? You know, have I done something wittingly or unwittingly that could have me become Me Too'd? It was a totally different landscape. And the accountability side of it was not ever part of Tarana Burke's original mission. Not that she doesn't want men to be accountable or perpetrators to be accountable, whoever they are, but her mission was really about healing and about solidarity and support. Me Too, as it launched in 2017, off the back of the Harvey Weinstein expose, and, you know, really off the back of Trump being elected and the rage around that, was something else entirely. It was a total coincidence. Well, we don't know this, but it's likely it was a coincidence that it too used Me Too, although it's obviously a powerful phrase. It's a happy coincidence, because I think had we just had, you know, a Hollywood approach to Me Too that then did go viral around the world, without a grassroots basis, I don't think we would have seen the longevity that we've seen of Me Too. And in fact, I think Tarana Burke, because she was able to step in and say, hey, you know, wait a minute, like, I've been using this phrase for the last 10 years to do this work. Please don't just like run away with the work that I've been doing, even if you're doing it inadvertently. But because she was able to step in, reclaim the movement, she's been able to sort of like rescue it from becoming quite superficial. She's like connected it back to the work. And that's unfortunately what we keep on having to do, is we have a very ahistorical approach to some of these movements. And when something flares up, as it did again last year, we can sort of really focus on what's happening in the moment and the people who are representative of the moment, and neglect to call upon and to platform the people who have been doing the grassroots work for years. And I think in Australia, you know, I know there's been a lot of conversations in the last 24 hours or so about like a new group of women, including Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins, Lucy Turnbull, and a bunch of others who are starting a campaign, all of whom deserve to be there. All of this, like, I have no problem with them starting a campaign the way they do. I think that sometimes, aside from the diversity conversation that's been had about that, is actually just, you know, where are those grassroots people? Where are the people with the decades of experience working in gendered violence? So I think that if we're going to have an accountability movement, it's not just about raising awareness, but is about like really not just holding perpetrators accountable, but seeding really long-term change. We kind of got to stop reinventing the wheel every time these things, these flashpoints occur, and see it instead as this slowly evolving, what I describe as sort of like a slowly evolving weather system. You know, use whatever metaphor you like, but that's the one that made sense to me, is that this is a firestorm in a slowly evolving weather system. And to understand what the firestorm means and what it portends, you also have to understand how the weather system developed, and what the firestorm, how the firestorm will affect the weather going forward. But to have that whole spectrum of experience present in how we prosecute it now.
Thanks, Jess. So that's really interesting. And just building on that, especially in relation to your point on it's about long-term change, how does moving from awareness to accountability change the language we as a society and the media speak about perpetrators and victims, or even survivors?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think that, well, first of all, it's not even so much that I think the language has not adequately changed to reflect the accountability moment that we're in. I think we still hide in the passive voice a lot. And I wrote something about that in the introduction to the essay, which was something that came to mind when the Women's Safety Summit was on, which is like, I was sort of stirring. I'm not suggesting that like you just adopt this idea, but like, what would our conversations look like if we called it a men's violence summit? Because essentially that's what we're talking about the whole time. And when we talk about women's issue, we're talking about men's violence. Like, why are they women's issues to begin with? It sounds like a lot of men who've got a lot of issues that are subjecting women to them. So, you know, maybe we talk about men's issues. But, you know, so I don't actually think that we have made the shift in our language to an accountability language where we use active language. But I think that the accountability part of Me Too has definitely changed, or it has influenced the sorts of conversations that have happened within that. And I think what's particularly forward-thinking and progressive, if not uncomfortable at times, is on days like International Women's Day. You know, I just went to one of those sort of like rah-rah breakfasts, which I always feel completely out of place in, because I'm just not a rah-rah. My inner critic is just far too enlarged for that. You know, the speakers there, particularly one speaker, Khadija Blah, you know, her address was all about how do you hold yourselves within the sisterhood accountable. So, like, I don't want to divert from the very particular problem of men's violence, but the accountability movement has also, I think, filtered down into feminism in a way that was not happening to this extent prior to 2017. When I say was not happening, not that women of color were not trying to hold the feminism to account, because that's been happening, you know, since there was feminism. You know, Sojourner Truth, like over 100 years ago, was holding feminists to account. But the platforming of this conversation, that accountability has actually become a theme within feminism that is circling around itself and going around in feedback loops, I think is really positive. So, and I think that also, like, where we are, like when I first started writing the book on domestic abuse, you know, I was writing the chapters on policing and on the courts. And back then, you know, a lot of the media reporting on police responses to domestic abuse were pretty positive. There was a sort of a quid pro quo, like, if you give positive coverage, you're going to get another ride along. A ride along gives you proximity to the action. Ride alongs, for people who don't know, is where journalists literally go out with the police and attend these call outs, and makes for good copy, makes for good, you know, television. And I'm not suggesting that like journalists are just sold out for this, but that level of access was something that people were seeking because they wanted to show what domestic violence looked like. And there's not many ways to do that aside from going on a police ride along and seeing like the just after the moment of crisis or right inside the moment of crisis. But I had also been guilty of this, is in preferencing that I had internalized sort of the point of view of police, because they'll always take you out with the police who are the progressive ones and who are doing the best jobs. You know, they're not taking you out with the guys who are getting the complaints against them. So I found it quite not uncomfortable. I don't have a problem with challenging police, but it was a thing that I had to do to get out of that old mindset and to do something that wasn't being done so much back then. Now, since then, and I'd say really with the coalescence of Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movement, police have come under incredible scrutiny. But police, the courts, the family courts, our politicians, this whole thing of accountability that really was generated by Me Too and the rage particularly about Donald Trump being elected, despite or even because he had come out so overtly as a misogynist and a racist, to name just two of his problems, that I think it reminded people what was at stake if we do not hold these institutions accountable, if we coast. And so in that way, again, you know, none of this stuff, Me Too doesn't operate in a vacuum. Me Too has been very much affected by Black Lives Matter. It's been affected by a number of different like intersecting movements, and obviously the political climate in general in different countries. It shows up in totally different ways depending on which country it has taken off in. So really, when we're talking about Me Too, we're talking about like, you know, a particular movement about sexual violence and sexual harassment and mostly women's safety and the safety of, you know, non-binary people. But generally speaking, like this is all happening inside various systems within which there are feedback loops and things that are changing the way that we come at it. And I think the most hopeful thing that I've seen about International Women's Day today has been, it's like we've been talking for long enough about gender equality, talking for long enough about men's violence to now feel comfortable enough, and when I say feel comfortable enough, we're being pushed by women of color to address racism, to foreground racism. And those voices are being platformed, I think, in ways that we haven't seen in years previous. That's what a sophisticated conversation provides the space for. But women of color are still having to take it. Like it's not just being given to them. You know, they're still having to fight and argue for it, and to cajole and to make, you know, women like me, white women, you know, uncomfortable about their role in this. That's the job that I think is the next phase of this.
And building more into that conversation and still speaking of language, what do you think are some of the movement's strategies to hear and engage audiences across spectrums and intersectional experiences and also respond to them?
So I'll start with the political spectrum because I did write about Nina, I wrote briefly about Nina Fennell's Let Her Speak movement, which I think, or campaign, not really movement. It was a campaign to change laws and to educate people in Australia around sexual violence and being able to disclose in public. And I thought it's Nina Fennell really understands, like someone who's worked at the grassroots often does, that change doesn't just happen simply because it should, or because it's fair, or that it's deserved, you know, and it can't be just pushed through with blunt force. It has to be strategic. And what I thought was brilliant about Nina's Let Her Speak campaign is probably the same thing that others might find distasteful, and that is that she ran it in the News Limited newspapers. This is a campaign like for and about victim survivors of sexual violence, not a natural fit with News Limited tabloids. But what she did is she knew how important it was to use this as a teachable moment. And as she said, you know, when every time there'd be a shift in the law or the campaign would have another win, she'd use that as an opportunity to platform that particular survivor. And there were 16 survivors, and use it to educate the readership on what that particular survivor had come up against. So whether it had been, you know, barriers for being disabled, for being trans, for being, you know, whatever it is that they had experienced. Now, as she said, News Limited readers generally were not going to be interested in just stories about sexual violence packaged in that way. But the reason why it was so successful as a campaign and so popular was that she didn't frame it as an issue of sexual violence. She framed it as an issue of freedom of speech. And News Limited readers are very activated by freedom of speech issues. So that meant that, you know, conservatives who would normally resist that kind of messaging were suddenly being engaged as well. And that's the point. Sometimes I think the women's movement, perhaps when we talk too often just to ourselves or to the choir, we can get sort of trapped in shoulds, and feeling. And I know when I started writing my book, part of there was a emotional block I had to get past, which was like, you should all eat your vegetables. You know, I'm eating the worst vegetables. You can just have 2 beans, you know, but that's really not a helpful approach, because actually no one has to read my book. No one's holding a gun to their head. I have to make it something they can't put down. And that's what that was the strategy that I tried to do, which is, you know, not a guaranteed strategy, but it was something that I worked very hard at. And I think Nina opening that up to such a broad political spectrum was a stroke of genius. In terms of like intersectional work, you know, like, as I said, like Tarana Burke's grassroots movement for young women of color was very much about connecting communities and doing that work on the ground. And of course, that has, you know, that continues as it always has in Australia in various communities. I'd say Me Too has not been successful in appealing to intersectional experiences, generally speaking. It is trapped, like even as we kind of move out of the trap of the ideal victim, which previously has been the victim who cries but doesn't cry too much, you know, preferably white, middle class, you know, someone you can have sympathy for, maybe someone with obvious bruises, you know, or someone who can prove what happened to them beyond a doubt, where there were witnesses. You know, there's a lot of things that have gone in to create the ideal victim, such that it actually only covers a very small, you know, number of people. Particularly, they should not be angry. That is not an ideal victim's type of behavior. Now, that kind of ideal victim has been overturned, but we kind of have replaced it with another now, which is, you know, white, not necessarily middle class, because, you know, Grace Tame's not middle class. She came very much from the working class, and you know, her mannerisms and everything are very much representative of that, and she's not shy about that. But I guess that kind of able-bodied, you know, approach, and people that we like to look at. We don't have a problem with them being angry so much anymore, but yeah, there's still a quite a narrow paradigm. But I think also it's difficult. Like, it will change. So, you know, I think back to what things were like when we had, like, the only models you'd see were size 6 or size 8, you know, and how that's changed, and how we now have plus size models. We have a greater diversity of cultural backgrounds, all that sort of thing, and how that took some really, you know, that had to be, it was done consciously. It had to be disrupted, you know, we had to see that that was our problem, that we didn't have enough diversity. And then that had to be disrupted by brands and by, you know, fashion designers who were brave enough to do that. So I think we're probably on the way to doing that. It's no surprise that, I mean, like when you think about, this is the ideal, this whole ideal victim paradigm, and the notion of even investing victim survivors of sexual violence with power, with cultural status, expertise, that is for Western societies or Western cultures very new. And you read stories like this recounted from Indigenous societies. One in particular, an Ojibwe woman who was raped by a neighboring group, returned to the tribe and was revered as a warrior and a medicine woman. And her experience was what she was subjected to and what she survived was central to what she became and became known as in that group. I don't remember a time in the last 2,000 years of Western civilization when that has been the case for victim survivors of sexual violence, who've either at best been pitied, at worst pathologized, blamed, ignored, disbelieved, etc., etc. So it's not surprising that the public, in making this massive leap to seeing victims, to not only giving many victim survivors the benefit of the doubt, but like raising a few victim survivors to icon status, that they have done that in that old prism of, you know, preferencing white, able-bodied, you know, attractive women. That's not a surprise. But now, yeah, the push is on to expand on that and to be like, how do we actually get that same public fascination and attention? Not just like, you've got to get the public fascinated in it, right? They're fascinated by Grace Tane. They're fascinated by Brittany Higgins. You know, you can't just say you should watch people from all backgrounds. We have to find a way to make them fascinating. And I know that sounds, I don't know, cold or harsh, or like it's coming through a media lens, but honestly, a big part of my work has been to try to figure out how to make domestic abuse fascinating. You know, that's actually what we have to do as storytellers or as journalists. You know, if we want to get the public to pay attention to stuff that they don't want to pay attention to, we need to make it fascinating. So that's what I'm wondering about. How do we do that? How do we shift this now forward so that it doesn't get trapped in another paradigm?
That's really a fascinating point. I might just pick a bit further on this, Jess. And you've written that, and I'll quote, "It's no coincidence that here and overseas, the Me Too landed so powerfully in two fields, entertainment and judiciary. There are two of the most influential parts of our culture. One establishes dominant cultural narratives, and the other decides what is socially permissible," end quote. So these are highly visible and high profile industries, and spotlighting them prioritizes the experience of privileged women. Building on what you've just said, how can we harness that same energy and scrutiny across all industries and institutions?
Yeah, it's a good question. And just before I answer that second part of the question, I think it has spotlighted more privileged women. As I point out in the essay, a lot of the women who have been Me Too'd, or, you know, who have become high profile, actually did not do so with their consent. So their stories became public actually largely against their consent, in various ways, where they were outed for political gain. You know, in the Jeffrey Rush case, for example, because a newspaper wanted to have a scoop and a front page and didn't want to do the work to actually back it up. So while it has prioritized the experiences of privileged women, those women themselves have been extremely disadvantaged by the spotlight that was put on them. And it is actually quite unique about the Australian situation, just how few women who were written about in this context did so of their own volition. The other thing I'd just say is that even though it's put the spotlight on the women, because of course we need a narrative and we need to hear about the actual people involved, I'd say that the focus on these industries wasn't really driven as much by a concern for the women, although that's not totally, insubstantial, but more for the integrity of the institutions they were working for, and the influence of them. So in the judiciary, particularly, the shock to people who were not already, aware of it, which was apparently most people within the judiciary and the judicial profession, that, someone like Dyson Hayden could be so predatory and known to be so predatory, was largely connected not to the up and coming graduates that he had harassed and turned off working in the law, but the fact that somebody in that position could be of that character was a paradigm shift for people. In entertainment, I mean, it's obvious because these are people that for a lot of people are either heroes or occupy a myth-making part of of Australian culture, and the people who are really having a huge influence on the cultural narratives that we hear or don't hear, so that, and not to mention the fact that, I mean, in the arts and entertainment industry outstrips all other industries by a country mile in terms of the prevalence of sexual harassment. And that's for both men and women. So it's 81 and 83% respectively. I think it's women and men, slightly higher for men, who have been sexually harassed within the arts and entertainment industry. Like, we were very upset by the idea that a third of I think women working in federal parliament had experienced that. And I would never endorse politicians applying a whataboutery lens to, a moment of their own accountability. But like, the fact is, it's a bit rich for the media to be sort of saying, well, that's terrible, isn't it? They really need to do something about their workplace. Like, our workplace is the worst. So that's why those high profile industries were also spotlighted. But how can we harness that same energy and scrutiny across all industries and institutions? That's what the Respect at Work inquiry did. That's why Respect at Work was so necessary. It was supported by Kelly O'Dwyer, a coalition minister who was very invested in this type of in seeking progress across all industries. And obviously Kate Jenkins, who has been, I think, one of the best sex discrimination commissioners we've ever had, who has taken this moment and leaped on it, ensuring that this does not just become a cultural flashpoint that we refer back to with interest in decades to come, but is a moment when these reforms got bedded down. The Respect at Work inquiry and the recommendations, which have to be taken as a whole, cannot be sort of sliced and diced in the way that the government has tried to do. If we just look at that central recommendation, the positive duty for employers to prevent sexual harassment from occurring, what that's saying is to put sexual harassment on the same par as workplace injury in terms of their responsibility to prevent it from happening in the first place. And for so long, for decades, the unions had to fight tooth and nail just to get employers to take responsibility for their workers on site, so that they didn't get electrocuted or, an arm cut off by a factory implement. Those sorts of gains were made at a time when there was very little interest in protecting workers' rights. They had that had to be gained through decades of hard work. And what Kate Jenkins is saying is that this should not be, we shouldn't actually be spotlighting women at all. We shouldn't be waiting for victim survivors to have to come forward and complain. You know, we should be we should be preventing it from happening, and here's how we can do it. And I think I read the Respect at Work inquiry cover to cover. It both fucking, sorry, excuse my French, but horrified me. And I am not easily horrified, having been knee deep in quite a lot of horror for a long time, but it was a new level of the sorts of things that people are being subjected to in workplaces across Australia. But the extent of the recommendations and the application of that whole of systems thinking as to how to change workplaces in Australia is incredibly impressive, and does, I think, hold a real key, just like Susan Ryan's incredible pioneering work in getting the Sex Discrimination Act up in the early 1980s, holds such a key to us being able to really see movement on this, so that women do not have to be, that no women's experience needs to be held up as the fodder for why we need to change anymore.
Thanks, Jess. The questions are building up at the Q&A, and I still have several questions. I might squeeze in one last question and we can go to Q&A to give everyone a chance, because we've got just around 10 minutes left. So in essence, do you believe that this movement can be sustained? And what does it mean to be successful in fighting for accountability and gender equity in our institutions?
I keep on being surprised at how the level of the movement is sustained. Really, since 2015, I was sort of, which is when Rosie Batty was Australian of the Year and domestic abuse became a front page issue, for, really for the first time. I've been sort of waiting for it to wane, and it just hasn't. I think for it to be sustainable, it needs to evolve, and I think it is evolving, a little bit kicking and screaming, but it is evolving, where we need to see the intersecting patterns, not only between like Me Too and the women's movement more broadly, but racism, sustainability, and climate change, the issues around the abuse of children. These are all intersecting issues. It's very important that we learn to talk about these as independent systems, but working within a whole, so that we don't have one conversation suck the oxygen out of others. Because at the moment, I get concerned that the conversation about gender equality sucks the oxygen out of the conversation about climate change. There's no reason why we shouldn't actually be dealing with both. In fact, the official theme for today is about gender equality for a sustainable future, very much about how what we're doing with gender equality, what we're doing with trying to achieve better racial equality, is about actually not just cutting emissions, which is obviously urgent, not just doing the things that scientists are saying we urgently need to do to stop runaway climate change, but changing the very systems that created this problem in the first place. That's where I think that this movement needs to expand into. I have every hope that is going to happen. There are a lot of skilled people, both who've worked in it for decades, but who are also coming to it anew and afresh, especially young people who can think in this much more broader intersectional way. I think that it will be with us for some time to come.
Great, thanks, Jess. I'll move on to the questions, and I'll try and accommodate as many as I can. And as Verity said at the start, we'll go through the most voted questions first. In fact, the one that's most voted comes from Melinda, and it's in relation to what you've just talked about, with one conversation taking over the other. So Melinda asks, can you comment on the dynamics that seem to still be in play, where the counter movements to women's rights /safety/justice seem to still be so overwhelmingly powerful in our thinking, societal approaches. And she says here, I'm thinking of how quickly and deeply the hashtag not all men angle seemed to take the wind out of all the sails of the Me Too movement.
Yeah, it's hard because backlash has always been a counter movement to feminism since it began. It is supremely uncomfortable for men for not all men. See what I did there? It's like it's just waiting for you in there. But it is like mostly supremely uncomfortable to have these conversations day in, day out. Especially when those conversations are reasonably new, if not just for this generation. But the thing is, it's tricky because anger has been the anger and rage, has been the propulsion fuel for Me Too, a great deal of its power. And yet, and this is where I think Tarana Burke is also just such a great lodestar. Anger and rage doesn't take us to where we want to go in the end. Like, we're not like getting together to chuck men off a cliff. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not, I think what we haven't really come to is an understanding of how can we collaborate with men on this. And maybe we've not been angry enough for long enough. I don't know. It's hard to know. We certainly needed the propulsion fuel to get us, going again. Can we trust men to come into this movement and not try to take it over? There's all these sorts of questions. But I think a lot of guys, it's, can feel disempowering for some men who feel like, well, maybe it's better if I just shut up. And then they maybe get sort of criticized for shutting up and not standing up. And I think there's a lot of confusion as to what we want, how we want men to be in this conversation and in this movement. I think it's always been thus. Male feminists from the 70s talk about that same thing, seen as a gender traitor by other men, but sort of looked at with suspicion by some women in the women's movement as to like, well, what do you really want? Or what are you covering for? Because as we've seen, plenty of guys have used things like White Ribbon and other organizations to cover for their own violence, so it's not without reason. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. I think that we will probably get better and more sophisticated at speaking about men. Hopefully we will attract more sophisticated and intelligent men to this movement that I think is growing in Australia, to really be able to speak to men about this, so that it's not just women speaking to men or women speaking to women. So yeah, that does need to develop. I don't think we've landed there yet.
Great. I've actually just looking at the next three questions, and they're still related on the men's perspective. So I'm going to read them out, and if you just want to respond, if there's something you think you haven't still addressed. So the first question is, are we doing enough to co-opt our brothers on women's issues or alienating them? The second question, do you think that, between brackets, most men support gender equality, or are we just kidding ourselves? Will it always be reformed by kicking and screaming? And the third question, how do we call men out on supporting sexual violence by their behavior if their behavior is if they're not calling it out themselves? So different aspects, but yeah, quite related.
It's good. I'm glad to see that there's such emphasis on men too, because I agree, that's where it should be. I think that so are we alienating them? Men are, just like women, a very diverse group. I think a lot of men have woken up to the reality of what women live with in a way that they were not aware of prior to Me Too, and including men who would have counted themselves as feminists, just had not been aware of it, just was not of interest to them, and etc. So that has happened. Are we also alienating some men? Yes. yeah, I think that there's a general sense at the moment where on various social issues, you can put a foot wrong and there can be quite a lot of heat that can come back on you, maybe deserved, maybe not so deserved, and where people who feel like they don't know the language and how to speak about these issues can feel a bit nervous about sort of like talking about them at all, which can lock out people who are not politically correct, or not say not politically correct, are not schooled on all the potholes, and are coming at this as people who are a bit more clumsy in this area. And so probably in order to not alienate them, we need to be just a little bit more forgiving of people who aren't sort of like skilled orators in this area and who may make mistakes. So do we have the capacity to forgive people for making mistakes? I'm not sure at the moment that we're great at that. What were the other questions again? It was, here we go. Do you think that most men support gender equality, or are we just kidding ourselves? I think there's a different, yes. So I think there are probably all sorts of different men here, men who support gender equality and will actually do something to achieve that, or put something on the line, or even sacrifice something. There are those men, they're probably more in the minority. Lots of men who support gender equality as long as it doesn't affect them. Lots of men who support gender equality up here and who go home and control their partners, also just saying. But I think the argument for gender equality is so blindingly obvious now. We're not having to come up against the same sort of stuff that we had in the 70s, where women are physiologically incapable of being in certain positions, or, like there was a lot of like, pseudoscience used to explain why the world was the way it was. Now it's like, there's no scaffolding for that to hang on. I think there'll be less kicking and screaming as we go along, because actually women are more and more in positions of power. So we're not just like begging from the street for crumbs from the master's table anymore. We are appealing often to other women in power to use their power to achieve better outcomes for all of us. And obviously we are still appealing to some men in power. But we're also saying, well, we are going to be much more unforgiving if you don't lead on this, and we'll use our votes, and we'll, in the between that, we'll use our voices to be quite forthright about that, and there is power in that too. How do we call out men on supporting sexual violence if they're not calling it out themselves? I think is the I'm not sure what that question means, but I'll just interpret it the way that I'm sort of thinking. And I'm sorry, Julie, if it's not what you meant. I think that I answered a question like this morning, is that like intervening and being not just a bystander, but someone who stands up in this area actually you need a bit of education in how to do that. You need education in how to do that in a way that doesn't see you then alienated from your friends if they judge you harshly for doing that. There's a lot of there's a lot more community education and discussion, I think, that needs to go on how to be an effective bystander. But also I think there's a lot of concern from men that if they call out someone else, that something in their history will come back to bite them. And I've talked to men who work in this area of sexual violence and are really dedicated advocates who, once Me Too came along, literally like had to go back and ask previous girlfriends, did I ever do anything that crossed a line with you? Because you have to remember, a lot of what Me Too has shown is that often men and women are living in quite different universes as to what they consider to be consent, what they consider to be respectful treatment, and that what some men consider to be consent, because they were able to coerce the woman into saying yes, for other women feels like violation or even assault. So we are still very early days in being able to establish just a common sense of experience and a common understanding that we both live in the same world, that men are going to be better at seeing that when they are trying to coerce against the will of the woman that they're trying to seduce, that's not just sexy Romeo and Juliet territory. And that we don't need them to be like 80 salesmen when they're coming onto us. But that's a real work in progress, but it's something that has definitely started under Me Too. And my God, like the level of consciousness among young men, particularly around issues around consent and the gray areas and role in consent, is light years ahead of where it was a few years ago.
Thanks, Jess. And I think that's a really great point to end our conversation on, just remembering those distinctions and different universes that we live in. I'm afraid we cannot take any more questions, although they're all great questions. We're slightly over time. So Jess, thank you so much for answering each question in detail and articulating everything. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And I also want to thank everyone for coming, and especially with such a great turnout. It's great on International Women's Day. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Saba.
Thanks. Bye.